everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. I'm Jerome Michuta, and it's great to be with you. You have now entered into the Virgin Most Powerful Apologetics Dojo. Because as I mentioned at the end of the last break, that Protestant Bibles are lacking, unless they have a Apocrypha section, 7 books that Catholic and Orthodox Bibles have. And those books are called the Deuterocanon. Protestants, of course, don't believe that they're inspired, so they call them Apocrypha. And so, how this happens, who's right? Which books are Scripture? Because if you're a Protestant and you follow the Bible alone, then which books belong in the Bible is paramount, right? Because otherwise you could be following false teaching, or you could be missing authentic teaching. So, like I said, the question of the canon in my book is probably one of the most important, if not the most important issue that separates us, because there's so many ramifications that fall from that. So we need to get it straight in regards to the canon. So, believe it or not, the issue actually developed way back in the time of Jerome, St. Jerome. And earlier in the first segment, we were talking about who St. Jerome was, his traits, and how they figure into this problem. And to me, it's really amazing that somebody who's so knowledgeable and so well-respected in antiquity on the Bible would get it wrong on such a basic question about the Bible. Also, I should mention, because I know I'll forget, maybe I should do this now, because if you are interested in this question, I go into it in much greater detail in my book, Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger. This is put out by Catholic Answers Press. Go to Catholic.com, and you can buy it right there. Or I also have this book. This is the Case for the Deuterocanon, Evidence and Arguments. This one you can get at GaryMichuta.com. The Why Catholic Bibles book gives you the history, starting with the Deuterocanon all the way through all of Protestantism and what happened to these books in Protestantism. Well, Case for the Deuterocanon is actually a positive case. What evidence is there that these books are inspired? So those 7 Old Testament books are the focus of our discussion. And like I said, interesting enough, it's St. Jerome, who is the Grinch who stole the Deuterocanon, so to speak. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. Now, as you know, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic, and also portions are in Greek. And so early on, there was a Latin translation of the Bible, starting with the Old Testament, of course. And this took place somewhere in North Africa around the 1st century. Very early on, most likely it was a Jewish translation. And this translation in North Africa, like I said, in around the 1st century or so, is known as the Old Latin. Okay, the Old Latin translation. The Old Latin translation, as far as we can tell, and it certainly appears that it did include at least some of the deuterocanonical books in that collection, which in and of itself, folks, is evidence that, wow, these books must have been part of the Bible early on. But anyway, I digress. The thing is, as the years progressed, the Old Latin translation of Scripture started getting a little messy. In other words, as translators were translating and retranslating and re-retranslating Latin, there began to be variants. A scribe could mistranslate a word, and that word would be copied, and then there would be now 2 versions of Scripture, one with the original word and one with the mistaken word. And it began to multiply until around the 4th century. The Old Latin that was available in the Latin-speaking West, right? This didn't really impact the East. In the Latin-speaking West, it was no longer serviceable. There was so many errors and versions that I think it was Jerome who quipped that there was as many versions as there were manuscripts. In other words, if you went to one church and started reading the Bible and comparing it to the church next door in the Old Latin, there'd be 2 different. They wouldn't agree completely in everything. So there really was a need for a brand new, fresh, scholarly translation, an updated translation, because of all these variants that made the Old Latin unserviceable. Well, enter St. Jerome. Now remember what we said. Jerome was invited by Pope Damasus I to come to a synod in Rome that was met there in hopes of healing an Antiochian schism. And of course, as we mentioned, Jerome was one of those rare people in antiquity who was fluent in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and like I said, even knew a little Aramaic. So Pope Damasus came up with a great idea that, why don't I commission St. Jerome, since he seems to be the best equipped person, to make a fresh translation of the scripture, and that would become the new Vulgate translation. And by the way, the Vulgate is become the official translation of the church, the official Latin translation. So, papal encyclicals, things like that, they'll quote from the Vulgate. So just FYI, this thing's still in service today. So anyway, he commissions Jerome to make a fresh translation. Jerome agrees, and 2 years later, the Pope dies. But nevertheless, he got Jerome started on the project, and like we said, it took a long time, actually up till Jerome's death, to actually finish or partially finish the Latin translation. So here's where things get sticky, folks. What happens with this translation? Well, Jerome needs to kind of go back to the sources, and because he can't rely on the Old Latin, because the Old Latin's not serviceable. So he goes and begins to translate the Bible like every other Christian translator before him. He went to the Greek Septuagint for the Old Testament. Now, the Greek Septuagint is a Jewish translation. It was actually began to be made about 2 centuries before the time of Jesus. And it's, by the way, the preferred text that's quoted in the New Testament. When they quote the Old Testament, chances are they're probably quoting the Septuagint. So he goes to the Septuagint, and there were also some other Greek versions as well, like the Symmachus and Aquila and perhaps some others. And he also had the Hebrew text that he could read. And he begins with the Greek, and he starts with the Psalms. So he does the Roman Psalter, which is generally considered like one of the most beautiful Latin translations of Scripture. And he does it primarily from the Septuagint. But, what he was doing was this. He would go to the Septuagint, you see how it's read. He would compare that to the other Greek versions to see if they're in agreement or not. And then he would try to figure out what they were translating from the original Hebrew and, check the Masoretic text, and then he would come up with his Latin translation. Well, for Jerome, this seemed like a lot of work for very little payoff, right? Because according to his mind, these the Septuagint and the other Greek versions were just loose translations of the original Hebrew. Okay, so why fool around comparing these loose translations of the Hebrew when I already know Hebrew? I can just go straight to the Hebrew text, right? It makes sense, doesn't it? But how do you know the Hebrew text is identical to that original autograph, that original inspired document that was penned? How do you know that they're identical? Well, Jerome's reasoning, and by the way, this is something that a lot of Catholic apologists get wrong. Some Catholic apologists appeal to, they say that, well, Jerome was buddy-buddy with rabbis. He was engaged in controversies, which is true. And when he was persuaded by their arguments against the Deuterocanon, and that's really why he got rid of these books. Okay. Now, in his writings, he does mention that he understands the argument. In fact, he even reproduces some of their arguments, but he makes it a point that that's not what he believes. Okay, so if you ever hear that used, folks, that's wrong. Okay, it's not that Jerome he thought the rabbis made a great argument, and so he changed which books belong in the Old Testament. Okay, that actually sounds kind of silly if you put it that way. No, he actually had a more methodical approach. He thought this. Okay, we have all these different Greek versions, they're all loose translations of the Hebrew. But there is only one Hebrew text tradition. There's only one manuscript that the Hebrews had in the 4th century. They all had a standardized text. And since there's only one, Jerome figured, well, if there's only one text, it must go all the way back to the beginning, right? That must be identical to the original. And all these other variants and versions and stuff must be copies of that one solid text, okay? And, in fact, that's true. At his day, there was really only one Hebrew text available. And so he thought, well, that must mean that Hebrew text is the truth, okay? In fact, he writes in his preface, and we'll talk about prefaces on the other side of the break. Well, actually, no, it's a letter 71. He says this: the canon of the Hebrew truth, or verity, the New Testament I have restored from the authentic form of the Greek original, for as the true text of the Old Testament can only be tested in reference to the Hebrew, so the true text of the New requires for its decision an appeal to the Greek. In other words, if it isn't in the Hebrew text that he is in front of him, it's not Scripture. Okay? If it is in the Hebrew text in front of him, then it's Scripture. Why? Because there's only one Hebrew text, and that text goes back to the beginning.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.